This episode is brought to you by Portland Distro. If you like underground music, movies, and more, go to portlanddistro.com for licensed merch, vinyl, CDs, and more. Plug in the discount code 10OFF, TENOFF, for a 10% discount at portlanddistro.com. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of Everything Went Black. This is part 2 of the Unholy Portland mini-series featuring Casey Logan of Murderbait. And for those of you who listened last week, you'll have our assessment of their brand new record, Nostalgia Like Cancer, and our thoughts on this fine band from Portland. Before we get into that, I just want everyone to be aware that we're running a Patreon. You can join Patreon for as little as $1 a month and get access to bonus content. And if you're doing the level 2, $5 a month, you can get early access to all of these episodes. I'd also like everyone to check out Everything Went Black podcast on Instagram, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter, even though I do not interact on Twitter. You know, it's funny, Ralph, like last year, he sent me a link to when the sun goes down, it goes down forever. And and he's like, man, this is right up your alley. It's like, you know, Fields of Nephilim, very dark, you know, this kind of somber like vibe to it. And I'd never heard Murderbait before. And of course, I was like very much into it as soon as I heard it. And when it came time to the end of the year, there's another podcast called Into the Necrosphere, and every year I'm a guest on there, and we do our best top records of the year. And I was like, oh, the Murderbait record, but then I realized it came out in 2019. So,
oh yeah,
or it didn't come out in 2021, so I couldn't. It wasn't eligible for my best record of the year or top favorite records or whatever you want to call it. But with that said, this year in 2022, there is a new Murderbait record. There's Nostalgia Like Cancer. Are you guys a 100% independent band, or you have are you working with a label? So what's the background with all this?
Well, we have been 100% independent until, and that's kind of the weird thing that happened with our last EP, When the Sun Goes Down, It Goes Down Forever. We released that ourselves, and that was actually the second release that we put out in 2019. And it was sort of, we had just recently added a new guitar player, an additional guitar player at the time. And we were just really eager to record something that had our current lineup in it. So we went in the studio, recorded a couple songs, and then put it out. I've personally, even though I've been playing in bands for over 25 years, I've never been very good at the business side of being in a band. In fact, a lot of my years of playing music, I've been vehemently against trying to do things correctly. I just wanted to create and put music out, and the whole, going through the process of finding a label and putting it out was not something I was even interested in doing. But with that last EP, we self-released it, and then like 6 months later, I ended up getting contacted by Mattia from Sentient Ruin Laboratories and he said, hey, I would love to put this last EP out on my label, just to put it out on vinyl. I noticed it's not pressed out on vinyl yet. We made a small run of cassette tapes that we did ourselves, everything from the packaging to the actual duplication and all that. But yeah, we didn't put anything out on vinyl, so he offered to do that. So, I mean, we were very excited about that idea. Sentient Ruin puts out some really great stuff. They have really good care in terms of how they curate the music that's on the label, and also, the packaging and all that sort of stuff that we are, as a band, pretty nerdy about. So we ended up putting that out on that label. And then at that point, we were already in the process of, we were mostly done writing the new album, Nostalgia Like Cancer, but we hadn't recorded it yet. And then we shortly after went into the studio, recorded. And in that time, we lost one of our guitar players, who was one of the original guitar player for Murderbait. He stepped down, and he's going to be moving back to Chicago here soon. Longtime good friend of mine, one of my closest, oldest friends. But him and his partner are moving back to Chicago, and so he stepped down out of the band, and so the band just shifted a little bit in our sound, and especially guitar tone wise. And when we handed the record over as it is, as it was recorded to Sentient Ruin, it was not, guitar tone wise, it wasn't what they were looking for. And it was just a little bit more on the doomy side, a little less on the straightforward goth, that sort of tone. So it had a little bit more of an Americana. To me, it's a little bit more leaning towards stuff like, some records from Earth or something along those lines. It's a little bit of that Americana style doom, which I love, but it just wasn't like anything else that was on Sentient Ruin. So it was too much of a stretch. So he was like, love the album, but it's just not, doesn't really fit quite enough. I mean, we were already kind of an outlier anyway for that label, but it was just a little too much. So, I mean, still, like, we still love Sentient Ruin. I'm actually meeting up with Mattia this coming Friday. So, everything's good with it. It was just, again, this album wasn't quite the right fit for that label. So, again, at that point, we're just want to keep putting out music and keep releasing music. And I mean, my focus and our focus has always been on creating and doing something meaningful that we enjoy and that we're proud of. So if no one picks it up or knows about it, then that's fine. We're just going to keep putting stuff out and keep writing and recording and releasing stuff. In fact, since that album has been released, we've been in the studio one more time, just for a single that we're going to be releasing coming up. Yeah, we're going to actually have a guest musician on that one, but I'm going to leave that one to mystery for a little bit longer until we get that all finished up.
Yeah. I can relate to being an outlier on a label for sure. With some of the stuff I do is just always a little bit hard to classify at times. Sentient Ruin, that's there's some black metal bands on that label too, right?
Yeah, it's predominantly black metal.
Right. Yeah, and I think Death Crux is on that, right?
Yep.
Yeah, those guys are cool. I like that band.
Yeah. Yeah, we were really stoked to be on the label, even though we're not at all black metal or any sort of metal necessarily. Some of my favorite bands are bands that have ended up on predominantly metal labels that are not themselves metal at all. I mean, bands like Zombie, even like Woven Hand and bands like that are not at all metal, but ended up on these predominantly metal labels. Something about that has been, I mean, I've liked the bands regardless, but for some reason, there's something really special about bands that are embraced by metal labels that aren't themselves metal. There's tends to be something really interesting about those bands. So for us to have been invited to be on that label it was pretty exciting for us. We're really happy about that.
How long has Murderbait been around? Because I for me, having only discovered you guys last year, and actually Murderbait's this kind of gateway band for me now. We'll get into that later, but there's, Ralph turned me on to, the EP, And then, of course, when the new record came out, we were both excited about it. And the deeper we got into I want to speak for myself now. Ralph and I are two separate people, even though we do have a lot of the same characteristics and a lot of the same likes and dislikes. But I'll speak for myself. I started getting deeper into the record, and then I started discovering more about some of the other bands that you play in and the other bands associated with what you guys do. And it's a gateway for me right now. So how long has Murderbait been around? Because that's the one thing I was was curious about. The formation of the band and other bands you guys might have played in and things like that.
It's a little nebulous because the band sort of started with, it was sort of a reaction for me getting out of playing in punk bands for about 15 years at that point, 10 or 15 years. And I moved to Portland and ended up, I had really young kids at the time, they were babies at the time, and ended up moving away from I didn't have my home instrument, which was my drum set, which all the bands I'd played in up until that point were bands I played drums in, and I was dirt poor, didn't have the money to have a space to play music. And so out of really sheer desperation for doing something creative, I just ended up picking up whatever instruments I could find, including this old piano I found off Craigslist for free, essentially, that somebody would just deliver to my house. And, the thing was god-awful out of tune, but, it worked enough, and just started collecting different instruments and sort of learned to do my own recording and learned to start playing various instruments on my own, just out of, again, boredom and desperation. And so, the earliest stuff that I was doing was literally just 2 cassette tapes put together where I'd record onto one and then play it on another. So I'd, start with some kind of percussion and then record it and then play it on a boombox while I record a piano part over the percussion that was playing off the other boombox, and layering, recordings by doing that.
Wow.
Just super, super archaic and not a great way of doing it. Technology had already, gone much, much past that in terms of what, was around, but I just didn't have any access to anything else at that time. And then, a few years later, was able to save up and get enough for a computer and some software for, just GarageBand and all that sort of stuff.
What did this cassette deck demo process sound like? What did the actual music sound like? That sounds like I'm so intrigued by what that might actually sound like, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I learned really quickly that you have only a few layers before you start just getting insane amounts of noise. So the earliest ones I started with piano, because usually I had a melody or something that I was playing that I would assume that I would want to write everything around that. But then I learned really quickly that every time I recorded, whatever I recorded first would start to go more and more into the background. And you'd start to pick up all this ambient noise that was unintended, the head noise from the actual cassettes, cars driving by, everything. You just picked up everything. And so I learned really quickly, what I want in the background, I should record first. And so, again, with whether it was percussion or whatnot, and then recording vocals or anything like that last, whatever I wanted up front. And yeah, they're very, very noisy, and very few people ever heard any of that stuff until I started to figure out some of the, more technologically relevant at the time means for recording music, which, and then just started doing that with GarageBand, and just honestly, I didn't expect or even write any of the music to play live or even to show anybody. It was just essentially a therapy for myself. It means to just get something out. But I ended up showing it to a couple friends of mine, and one of them in particular talked me into forming a band and actually doing something with it, which at the time, again, I wasn't really terribly interested in doing, because I was still, I have three boys who are all now either teenagers or young adults. And at the time I was, full-time parent, full-time job, just really no time to speak of. But yeah, this good friend of mine talked me into it, saying, "Hey, I really believe in this. I believe in what you're doing. I would love to play whatever you'd want me to play to make this happen and make this come to fruition." So we formed. We got between him, he ended up playing bass, and then we got another friend who was interested in playing drums, and formed the first real lineup for Murderbait. Started playing out a little bit here and there. About around 2010, 2011 was when we actually started to get more serious. But it was a different band. I mean, everything was so, literally everybody other than myself, is no longer in the band. We didn't even have a guitar player at the time. But then a few years later, about 2016, 17, one of my closest, the bass player, original bass player, stepped down. And one of my oldest friends that I knew back in California, where I grew up, who we'd played music in New Zealand, we played music back in California, we played music here in Portland a little bit here and there.
Wait, hold a second. New Zealand? Like, it's one thing to go from California to Portland. But you're like, yeah, we played in California, New Zealand, and like...
Yeah, Minneapolis. Him and I somehow we've ended up in all these different places together at the same time. And so we have this really interesting history. I mean, people mistake us for siblings, often say, "Oh, that's your brother, right? Like you guys look like you're brothers." But yeah, as soon as the bass player stepped down, Seamus immediately came to mind. He's always been one of my favorite people to play music with. He's somebody I trust, and just always stylistically been on the same page about music. And so had him, asked if he would be interested in stepping in, and he was, and it's been great. And then shortly after, the drummer stepped down, original drummer stepped down, and then our new drummer, new at the time for us, stepped in, and I mean, he's a phenomenal drummer. The first time I saw him was playing in a Susie and the Banshees cover band, which, I mean, the drumming, Budgie's always been one of my favorite drummers, and in terms of some of the creativity and how he tends to approach music. So watching a drummer just really nailing those parts as if they were his own, I was immediately impressed. And so when I found out that he was interested in playing with Murderbait, I was like, oh my God, yeah, I would love for him to join. And at that point, our guitar player, Jason, had already been in the band for some time, and he's somebody I've known from Chicago. And again, another very, very close friend. So it was, the four of us, and that's where we put out our self-titled album, was with that iteration. We decided to go with the self-titled album because, frankly, it felt like we had really stepped into our own sound more than any other album. We put out a couple before, but everything kind of felt less focused, or it just felt more meandering. And with this, the self-titled album, it felt like we'd really stepped into our own. So
I would agree with that, because I pretty much downloaded all this stuff on your Bandcamp page, so I'm pretty familiar with So the other material on there is older stuff, like We Hold Nothing in Our Hands, like that
Yes.
record. Okay, that's prior.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally different band at that point. Yeah.
Right. Now, actually, I have a question about some of that. You were saying that you played in punk bands, like before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what kind of punk is it? Like, like crust punk, or like pop punk? Like what? And
Definitely not
I'm
pop
always
punk.
interested in this. I'm always interested
Yeah.
in the transition when you're like a young guy and you're playing a very like a style of music that's I mean, I look at punk and hardcore and stuff like that as kind of like young man's endeavors into creativity. But when across the board, everyone who moves past that, because some people don't make it out of they do their thing. One guy goes to college or whatever, and then the band breaks up and people go their separate ways. But the people who stick around and remain creative and they use that, they springboard into the next thing, like that transition, I always find very fascinating with musicians. So for you, what was that like?
So for me, I was absolutely obsessed. And when I say punk, I don't mean, I really discovered punk for me was, in the early 90s. And I was still stuck in the late 70s and early 80s. Really anything past 85 kind of lost my interest. Once punk became a genre that had its own sound and had definitions, it became less interesting to me.
So maybe bands like X or something like that, and
yes, absolutely,
like
X,
the Screamers or something,
Yep, Crass.
Okay.
Like Subhumans. Even early Clash and Television, and bands that are like a little bit more on the fringe of even what was considered punk. Those are bands that I was absolutely obsessed with. So a lot of the music that I played, when I was really young, was a lot more like 80s style or even like anarcho type punk, and even had a band that was more of like 77 style punk when I was really young. But again, and a lot of it got darker and darker as I continued playing in those bands, and even almost like, don't want to abuse this term, but even almost prog in the sense of what punk would be considered, not 3-chord style punk songs, but more what you would expect when you listen to like later Subhumans, where it tends to be a little bit more complex in terms of the song structures and whatnot. That's what I was, just really obsessed with. And then right around the time that I had kids, there's something really, for me at least, like stepping into fatherhood, I couldn't just keep on with this angst and anger and like music that was, really aggressive or it just wasn't really fitting with what I was feeling at the moment. But I've always liked music that was darker. I've always liked music that was thought-provoking, which is what led me to a lot of the punk music that I liked. And I ended up kind of stepping back. And for a while, I listened to almost nothing rock in general. I went through a huge phase where I was obsessed with, early folk music, and Eastern European music, piano music, whatever, anything that wasn't like, I kind of got burned out on guitar driven music. And then over time, that just sort of blossomed and like, I was also at the time absolutely obsessed with stuff like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, because when I heard that, it was like, oh man, here are guys who are essentially playing in a band with rock, instrumentation, but they don't sound like a rock band. They don't sound like anything that's really been forged before. And then, in a similar way, like you were saying, Murderbait has been sort of a gateway to all these other bands. they were a huge gateway because, you know, you find out about like Neubauten and all these other all these other musicians that have been a part of the Bad Seeds. Obviously, the Birthday Party, Crime in the City Solution.
Oh yeah.
You know, Roland S. Howard, like all of his projects, and it's just like it becomes this whole world that I just had no idea in my youth, and just became completely obsessed with all these bands that were a little bit more in the darker, and they all had this sort of beauty to them, and which also really appealed to me because it was dark, but it also had this balance with something that it wasn't just trying too hard to be like, ooh, look, we're dark, we're sinister. It was like it showed a better spectrum of human emotion and the human experience that I just really, really appreciated and was looking for in music in general.
Yeah, I remember discovering all those bands. Actually, it's funny. I discovered them through reading Henry Rollins's books that he published, and he would talk about bands like Swans and the Birthday Party and Neubauten. You know, and he had like the Neubauten tattoo, and you know, at the time I was very much just into like, you know, obviously bands like Black Flag and, you know, like Slayer and you know, just super aggressive music, and the Swans, when I explored that realm, and then that led me to the Birthday Party, and then that was a gateway into like a whole other world, and it felt like this kind of secret music that was going on like behind the scenes somewhere, you know, like it's some midnight like rendezvous somewhere on some deserted street. You had to go listen to this music, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And it almost had it's music that almost has a philosophy behind it and a depth behind it that is what has drawn me to it, you know, with the Swans, and especially it's like thinking person's music. It's music that there's something more than just like, oh, go to a show, see some music, that's it. That was a fun experience, one-dimensional. Music that challenges your thought process, it challenges your reality. It's cathartic, but it's also thought-provoking. And yeah, that was what I was really leaning towards, and have continued leaning towards. And like I said, having also come out of being obsessed with a lot of other cultures, music, and learning just like starting to appreciate things like drone and what headspace a good drone will put you in. It's this meditative thing and it's something that krautrock really did well at driving in. It's approaching music in a way that's not structured, in a way that's going to be more of your prefrontal cortex of just like, oh, this is a song, and I'm figuring out the structure, and it's a pop, you know, structure, and it's going to start and it's going to end, and that's it. It's so driving and so rhythmic or so droning that it starts to put you in a space that's almost starts to lose sense of time and space. And then if you introduce layers on top of that, whether it's a new melody on top of a driving rhythm or a driving drone, then all of a sudden it puts that melody in a different light, because you're in a different part of your brain. You're processing that song and that music from a different part of your brain that's almost not even connected to the here and now, or so connected to the here and now that you're not thinking about the structure anymore or whatnot. And so bands like Swans really do such an amazing job of driving that approach to music in a way that's always been really intriguing and really inspiring to me.
Well, this definitely gives some context to you know, your early explorations with the cassette deck recordings, you know, and using piano and having this sort of unconventional way of approaching that creative process back then, and how that morphed into the band, you know.
Yeah. I mean, I've always, I think that's again what always drew me to early punk as opposed to some of the more established later stuff was that it was, I mean, you listen even like early post punk stuff, like, I mean, you listen to Bauhaus, like early Bauhaus is, it's essentially like this weird amalgam between dub and a little bit of psychedelic and, you know, some early
Well, that
I
dub, the
mean
dub thing was like a very British like thing that was going on. I feel like even
yeah.
like Public Image Limited had like
Oh yeah.
a pretty heavy dub
Ab-
thing going on in those early records too.
yeah, absolutely. And it's, but it becomes its own thing because it's this bizarre mix of several other things, but in a way that no one, you know, there wasn't already a forged path of like, oh, this is what goth music is going to sound like, and or this is what it should sound like. And so, I mean, even like early punk stuff with like the X-Ray Specs, like, I mean, they sound nothing like, you know, the Buzzcocks, and they sound nothing like every other punk band that was at the time. You know, everybody was completely doing their own thing, and that unforged path of approaching music and writing music that has, you know, it sort of exists outside of a genre was always really inspiring to me. And I think that's what led me to feeling super detached from punk music in my early 20s, because I had been in a punk band for, you know, several punk bands for over 10 or 15 years at that point. I came to learn very quickly that once you're in a scene like that, you are expected to play that genre's music and exist by that genre's rules and limitations. And I mean, I myself was one of the people that was like, oh, we can't do that because that's not very, you know, that doesn't really sound very anarcho punk, you know, to play that or to do it like that. And it just drove me crazy toward the end. I was just like, I don't want to have these limitations. But you know, at the same time, some limitations are great, but I was really, at the time, really burned out on it. And so I wanted to strip myself of everything and try to see things from a different perspective. And now at this point, you know, I love it all. And I feel like I have so many less limitations, but I'm also not afraid for us to do something that could easily be defined, just as much as I'm not afraid to do something that is outside of any of those genres or parameters too. So it's been a nice place to be in recently, and it's really taken this time with playing music with people that I really trust and that frankly have enough patience with me to be, you know, to allow me to go through these processes and to know, like, we constantly do. I mean, this last album that we recorded with Nostalgia Like Cancer, several of the songs had probably about 5 different renditions of them that were completely different before we landed on the one that ended up on the record. And it was a necessary process. We would throw it all out, play it all, reel it back in way too much, redo the structure, change the time signature, you know, whatever it was, and listen to it 500 times, realize, hey, you know, actually, I think it might be like this instead, and approach it in a completely different angle. And I mean, it's probably the album that I'm most proud of all the music I've ever played. And it was because of that process that I feel so good about it.
That's awesome, man. I mean, so there's a lot of demoing, I imagine, that goes on, and just dissecting of all the songs and different ideas. That's always a very healthy thing, even though it's at the time it probably seems like obsessive and crazy, you know, to go through all these different, you know, painstaking, you know, processes and things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you always have the the one person in the band, or at some point when you're right about to, you start feeling good about something, and then somebody throws a wrench in the works. But it's necessary, and it drives you crazy at the time. You want to strangle the person, and we've each been that person at one point or another in this last album, each of the band members. But it's always worth it. And sometimes you go through the process and you land on, no, this was right. We were doing it right this whole time. But even just going through that process of questioning it, are we sure this is right? Is this the right way to approach a song? It's worthwhile. It's still good to go through that, and then everybody being on board and really like catching that vision and catching the purpose and the reason behind it. I can hear it. I can feel it when there's the difference between getting through a song and really feeling a song for each musician.
Yeah, for sure. On the self-titled record, that's definitely, I agree. That's where the sound of the band actually kind of formed, even though I wouldn't say that I hesitate to say it was defined, because that record definitely sounds different than Nostalgia Like Cancer, and you were mentioning there was some lineup changes and whatnot, but I mean, it's not like you defined it and this is like the template for every record, but there's definitely a characteristic to the sound of the band, which was set on that record, which carried on through the next 3 records. And once again, it's like we were talking about earlier, it's hard to define, but there are definitely some key elements, and a lot of that has to do with your voice and the heaviness of the music without it necessarily being heavy. You know what I mean? Like the music sounds like there's like a big emotional component to it. So I guess the next thing I'd like to ask is like lyrically, are these like personal lyrics, or are they observational, or delving into the esoteric, or like what's the basic vibe in the lyrics?
I'm mostly very autobiographical, but at times contemplative in terms of looking at and just observing the human condition. But a lot of the lyrics that I write are things that I've frankly learned in therapy and through, a lot of therapy and going through things. And they're just obviously on my mind heavily. I've always struggled with depression as far back as I can remember. And so living with something like that from a very young age, it leaves you feeling sort of on the outside of interactions that you have and even community and people that are around you. And often for me has often led me to sort of feel like an observer of humans, human condition, and what it's like to interact with other people and even with myself. And so these things are just, constantly going through my mind, and a lot of the lyrics that I write are essentially me processing how to navigate life. So, I mean, even like on our first, on the self-titled album, songs like Ruts are, that song is essentially about neural pathways, and that understanding and coming to the realization about, trying, years of talking therapy and medication and various, EMDR therapy and different things to try to address chronic depression and anxiety, and having, being really frustrated with the lack of results at times, and understanding how neural pathways work, and that these like deeply entrenched neural pathways that we, essentially have built into our minds, and how we handle things and how we process things in life. They're just like these ruts that we get stuck in, and everything starts to fall into those ruts and becomes this familiar pathway of how to process things. So yeah, so a lot of it's, that type of stuff. And then, but on Nostalgia Like Cancer, there's also some observational lyrics just about the state of the world. The opening track, Lost, where Nostalgia Like Cancer comes from, was in a lot of ways a response to just the sort of unraveling of our culture that came about around 2016, where we sort of fooled ourselves into thinking we were a post-racist society and we were all these things, and we're so far and advanced, and we're so evolved now, and it became painfully evident for anyone that that is not the case, and has since just has gotten worse and worse to show us how we're essentially the same that we've always been, in terms of people and their biases and their willingness to hate others and be divided for political or, reasons that are essentially somebody's not like me. And so I am afraid of them, or I at default don't like them or don't trust them. And so that song in particular is essentially lamenting of humanity, its tendencies to repeat the past and repeat these horrific histories that we've endured over and over and over again, continue to do the same thing.
Actually, it's funny you mentioned that, because I think that it's almost like the last 4 or 5 years have been this anthropological study of data chunking and how biases arose in the human, like hominids, basically, where there's like, rather, out in the wild, when we were running away from tigers, we would, like, the early hominid would gather information, but not specific information. It would be like, okay, shape, size.
Yep.
It's a threat.
Equals
run away. Or attack.
Threat. Yep.
Yeah. So it's almost like that instinct has never been refined to meet the modern world. You know what I mean? And that's what it feels like. Back in the 90s, it felt like a totally different world than it did in 2016.
Yep.
And that's just a reminder that we're still these like bizarre tribal like apes,
Yeah, we're not ready to. We're still existing. The way that our brains function are still in this very primal modality, and we're trying to process all these ridiculously difficult and sophisticated bits of information that are, just too much for us to handle. But the worst part about it is that most people trust themselves to not be, affected by our primal brains. So it's this idea that, anybody who thinks that they have no biases, for example, is the one that you just really can't trust the most.
Yeah.
Everybody has biases. That's how our brains work. To recognize that we have biases and to challenge those biases, those are the people that you're going to trust more, because they recognize that they have this fight or flight brain that's still looking for tigers in the shadows, but recognizing that those tigers don't exist, and that's just whatever the situation at hand is, but recognizing again that we still have that same hardwired brain that is looking for those dangers. Yeah, so that's a lot of the theme for this newest album, is essentially about that, and also just the cancer in itself. That was using that word in the album was actually a point of some argument in the band for a moment, because we know that it's a provocative word, and it understandably brings up a lot of pain for a lot of people, and rightly so. Everybody in the band, we've all lost close people to us from cancer. Both of my parents had cancer. They're cancer survivors. Essentially all of my grandparents died of cancer. It's something that's very, very close to us in the worst kind of way. But this, again, I think I just got so tired of hearing. I think I heard the term "our forefathers" one too many times in reference to some sort of thing to aspire to. And, this idea that things were so much better back then, or, we knew what we were doing back then, or life was so good back then. And it just wasn't. I mean, of course, certain things, sure, you can recognize that there's some things, gas prices were cheaper 10 years ago,
Yeah.
Like you could be specific about certain things, and those are facts. But I remember hearing this really interesting study about how every time we recall a memory, it becomes less and less accurate. And it was somebody that was talking about, specifically they were talking about in court when you're interviewing a victim or a witness to a crime. The more times you ask them, that witness or victim, to recall the situation, the less accurate it becomes. And you could theorize why, but I agreed with the person who was speaking in this interview. They were saying that it's likely because as human beings, we tend to compartmentalize and we tend to categorize things. So we just, again, it goes back to that primal brain. We like to label something as a threat if it means that it's going to keep us alive. And so when we look back on memories, we start to compartmentalize and categorize things. It's like, oh, this was good. This was the victim. This was the villain. This was the hero in the story. And we turn our memories into narratives. And then those narratives, they're a story. They're no longer factual. They're no longer recalling what actually happened. We're telling a story, whether it's to ourselves or to other people. And then we run the risk of just all living in this fiction of our own minds. And that fiction can so often does become a vehicle for pushing dogma and pushing false, just lies about what, anytime you hear, again, somebody say something about our forefathers here in America, it's like, God damn it, those motherfuckers were slave owners and the most sexist people on the planet. These were not people to look back on and saying, yeah, they knew everything. They were just the epitome of humanity.
Well, furthermore, there were a bunch of criminals and religious rejects, like Protestants,
Yep.
that couldn't hang in England, so they had to leave basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Sure, they might have had some good ideas, but yeah, lots of people have good ideas who are, as a whole, not good people. And so that's what a lot of this album really challenges and talks about and thinks about is just these themes of what it is to exist and to be human, and recognizing those, being human is messy. It's not this clean, nice and tidy experience of, oh, this person is good and this person is bad, or this situation was good and this situation is bad. It's a mix of all of it. And when we stop realizing that and we start infusing this narrative, it just becomes less and less real and less true. And again, we just run the risk of diluting ourselves into this story that's not reality. Which, frankly, whatever. Maybe that's better.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I was going to add was like, you can even extrapolate that further out. And if you think about just and everyone's perception of reality is very subjective. I mean,
Hmm.
you know, I mean, I don't know if you've read like Thomas Ligotti or any of that kind of stuff, but there's like the idea that our personalities are just these like dreams and like reflections of like a physical world that is detached from any kind of intellect, really. And that everything that we're perceiving as reality is an illusion, essentially. And in some ways that's true, because
Yeah.
in order to survive, there's so many things that have to be filtered out of our perception. Otherwise, like there's even certain like colors and sounds and things like that that are not perceptible, even, things like that. So
Hmm.
I also apply that idea just to like a subjective reality, and as you've
Hmm.
seen over the last few years, there are a multitude of subjective realities that people are living in that are completely independent from one another, and they really believe that those realities are true.
Hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, say you could say that about religion and any spiritual belief or any belief in general. And at the end of the day, if it makes you a good person and you're able to show up and it gets you through your day, then whatever, doesn't, no skin off my back. But again, all too often the problem becomes when it sort of becomes this mission, or it's weaponized essentially, and all too often. And I agree. I think, like what you're saying with recognizing, and you know that we, part of what's necessary to survive is to tune out certain things. I mean, it's one of the things about when you start losing your hearing. It's one of the big things, isn't that you're hearing everything. You're hearing everything on that same level. It's why hearing aids are really challenging, because it's like they turn everything up, but they don't differentiate the person speaking to you and tuning out everything else. Our brains are really, really good at tuning everything else out that's unimportant and focusing on the important thing. And we do it with smell, we do it with sight, we do it with our memories, we do it with everything. And some of us are much better at it than others. And it's probably why those of us who are anxious and depressed, we're less good. In some ways, it could probably be argued that we're just less good at tuning out the things that we should tune out. It doesn't make it any more real or any less real to exist in that state, but it's, for whatever reason, some of us just have a really difficult time not focusing on those things.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but and in some ways, like, there's these theories about our brains just being these kind of dream machines, really, where,
Hmm.
where your personality, the reality, like everything that is in your existence is a projection of some,
Hmm.
yeah. But with that in mind, that's also very powerful too, because if in a fact it is a dream, you can
Yeah.
control like what aspects of that dream what passageway through that dream that you take.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier, Murderbait was this kind of gateway band for me, and so I also discovered Dry Wedding. So I'm gonna have Davey on in a couple of days, and we're gonna talk about Dry Wedding, and that's a band I discovered, uh, with Murderbait being a gateway. And I also found out about Shadowlands, which is the band that you play drums in,
Yeah.
and that there is this web that connects Murderbait, Shadowlands, and Dry Wedding with members and relationships and all this other stuff. And so yeah, Shadowlands is great. I've actually moved a little bit past my Murderbait phase, and I'm in my Shadowlands phase right now, and I'm listening to 003, like that record. That's the one that has the song "The End" on it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
really digging that record.
Yeah. It's my partner sings, and she's the predominant songwriter for Shadowlands, and sings and plays synth in that band. And then, like you said, I play drums in Shadowlands. And actually, the guitar player for Murderbait, the original guitar player, Jason, was also the original guitar player in Shadowlands. And then he stepped down out of Shadowlands just because playing in 2 bands was too much for him at the time. And then my partner Amy, her twin sister, identical twin sister, plays guitar, and so she stepped in, and she's been playing. And so 003 is the first album that she is the guitar player. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy, like I said, playing drums is my home instrument, and so I can't imagine. There have been times where it's like, oh, maybe playing in 2 bands is a lot, especially again being, having a full-time job and having 3 kids and all that sort of stuff. It's very, very busy, but I couldn't imagine doing one or the other. With Murderbait, I'm writing the majority of the music, I'm writing the lyrics, and I'm singing and playing synthesizer and keyboards and all that sort of stuff. But then Shadowlands, just being able to let somebody else write the songs, and playing drums also is just, it's another part of me that for me I need. Yeah.
That's awesome, man. The guitar work on that record I particularly like. Actually, that stuck out as that being like something that I was like very, very much drawn to, the guitar work on 003. I think that, so it's interesting that there's a new guitarist on that record.
Yeah, she did a fantastic job of stepping in. Some of the songs were already at least partially written, but others we hadn't written at all by the time Angie joined the band. But she did a fantastic job of stepping in and taking it and running with it. She predominantly was playing at the time folk music.
Oh,
she
wow.
was in a folk music project, and so some of it was literally just like, okay, so here are all the guitar pedals that you're going to need to buy. And but her and Amy grew up listening to a lot of the same music, obviously, being twin sisters. And so a lot of the stuff, it's really interesting to watch them record and play, because they definitely have some of that weird unspoken twin communication going on, that they'll just sort of have a conversation with very few words, and somehow they know exactly what they're talking about. And then with Shadowlands, also the bass player Amy calls him her band husband, because she's been in I think gosh, like 6 or 7 bands with him over the years. And so it's just everybody's so incredibly close in that band as well. So it's we just love being around each other and just really care about each other, and writing music is just really, really, really fun. It's really a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's dark, but in this kind of Julie Cruz way, you know what I mean? It's dark, but it has like this kind of beauty to it, which is really, really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that song, The End, is actually one of my favorites of ours. It has such a Twin Peaks vibe, but also very Disintegration era Cure, which I mean is, to me, some of the one of the best albums of all time. And it has everything that I like in the song. It's got a hooky melody, but it's dark, and it's got this ethereal, just it scratches all the itches for me musically. So yeah, that one in particular has a real special place in my heart.
Have you guys been playing, like both bands, like playing shows, like since things have sort of gotten returned to normal somewhat, depending on what part of the country you're in, I guess?
Yeah, off and on. Both bands have gone through some canceled plans. In fact, both Murderbait and Shadowlands had to cancel a show a couple weeks ago because we all got COVID, or I got COVID. My kids brought COVID home, and then got me and my partner sick. And then other bandmates ended up catching it too. So we had to cancel. And then there have been other times in the past where, just due to restrictions and whatnot, that it got canceled outside of our us as a band. But yeah, we've been still playing out, and we have some shows in the future that are coming up. So yeah, it's been such a weird time because all of us have been playing music, since we were in our teens, and it's so weird to be in a place to see. There's a little while where we were wondering if, live music was going to be a thing anymore.
Yeah, I think everyone had that fear,
And it's like I said, I have my three kids. One of them's in college, and the other two are teenagers. And my middle son's actually really phenomenal guitar player. Was playing in a band for a few years, and he ended up quitting in the middle of the pandemic, and sort of just kind of stopped seeming to care about music or shows or anything. And then only recently started finding a group of kids who are going to shows all the time. And frankly, Portland, one of the things Portland is really not very good at is having all ages venues. There's very, very, very few here in town. And so it's really hard to find anything that's under 21 for shows. And he found a group of kids that essentially have a community of, sort of a ring of like, hey, here's where the show is going to be at today, and it's going to be at this house, or it's going to be at a burrito shop or whatever. And it's just revived his passion and love for music. And frankly, that's been one of the most encouraging things that I've seen in a long time, because again, it's been such a powerful and beneficial thing to me. And to fear that, like, well, maybe this is something that's going away, was really depressing. So it's good to see that, these younger generations are carrying the torch and still excited about going to shows and playing music and watching live music. So that frankly has been something that's encouraged me to, like, okay, yeah, let's keep booking shows, let's keep doing stuff, let's try to book some tours, in the future. And that's definitely the hope. We all love playing, and as long as people will show up and want to see us, we'll keep playing.
One of the worst things that happened to me during the pandemic was doing one of these like live recorded video kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we shot this thing, and it wasn't even live streamed. It was just captured and then released as a live performance. And I was listening, man, this fucking sucks, man. Like, this is like, this isn't even that fun at all, And it's like,
yeah,
it's such a horrible feeling to do that,
It's all the sterileness of being in a studio, but without any of the graces that being in a studio allows you. Yeah, I completely agree. I've seen so many different attempts at what shows could be. I'm sure Davey will tell you. I saw a Dry Wedding attempt a show where they were playing behind glass inside while everyone was outside, and the music was piped outside through speakers. And it's cool to keep trying and attempting new things, and I'm all for innovation and something that's interesting and safe, and keeping people alive and keeping venues open and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, just nothing replaces that human interaction. And it's essentially, it's that religious experience without the dogma. It's that, like, something that's very, in my opinion, it's just innately human, and what everyone is looking for. It's that right brain, like, dissolving of the sense of self, and dissolving of that concern or even awareness of the past or future, And it's that here and now, it's the congregation, all that is just, you can't fake that. You can't replicate that in any other context outside of something that's, you're feeling that music right in front of you, and you're surrounded by people that are also experiencing the same thing as you in real time. Yeah, it's just nothing replaces that.
Absolutely. So where can people find information about both bands? Bandcamp. Like what's all the relevant locations on the internet that people can find news and music about you guys?
Yeah, Bandcamp is one of the best in terms of what music we have available, merchandise, and all that sort of stuff. Any direct. I'm really good at responding back to folks and all that sort of stuff. I manage the Bandcamp page, and then we also use Instagram a lot for keeping people updated on the band and what's happening and different happenings, especially in terms of shows and upcoming news or whatnot. Happens a lot on Instagram and through that, Facebook too a little bit. But those are the main ones outside of just continuing on in the shadows of the band off to the side of outside of the internet.
Well, I had a great time, and it was nice talking to you, Casey. And thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.